Good evening, my dear friends in Dillon. I'm coming to you from St. Paul's Methodist Church in Helena, as you know, and I'm speaking today in the pure daylight, but when you hear this, it will be the evening of Christmas in Dillon, and so I want to wish each of you a Merry Christmas, and certainly I will look forward to being with you this Advent season. I also am aware that this would be the last presentation that I'll be making to you this calendar year, and so I want to thank you for what has been a thrilling experience for me being your pastor these past, I guess it's been 5.5 months, and I'm really looking forward to extending my pastorate with you the next 6 months, and I just want you to know that it's been my pleasure, and I've gotten to know many of you and close to many of you, and it's being your pastor has been a thrill and a meaningful experience to me. So I want to thank you and again wish you Merry Christmas. I'm not wearing my usual vestments, as you can see, and I'm doing that for a reason, because Christmas Eve should be a time of deep breathing and deep thinking and relaxation, time with family, time in worship. And so I want you to take a very deep breath and breathe in the spirit of Christmas as you sit here tonight, and give thanks to God for bringing us to yet another Christmas Eve. Our year has been turbulent in many of our lives, and yet here we are, and we are so thankful that God has led us to this place and continues to be with us, which of course is the message of Christmas. So take a deep breath. Tonight I want to talk to you about hope. And the reason I want to talk to you about hope is that is the message and the essence of Christmas. You of course know that the gospel stories about Jesus and the birth stories were written long after Jesus was dead and resurrection. Probably 20 to 30, depending on which gospel you're talking about, years after Jesus no longer was with us in his bodily form that we know of as we read about him in the Gospels. And so the stories of Christmas, as well as the Gospels, were written long after people realized that he was in fact the Messiah. And so they wrote these with the spirit of hope that he brought. And they were able to write these stories of his birth and to write the stories of his life as an expression of the hope that he brought to people who were very oppressed in Palestine at the time. And hope then is the message of Christmas. It's the message of the Gospels. And so I want to talk to you about hope tonight and help you think with me about what it means. I've done a little reading about hope and since I last saw you and preparing for this presentation, and several things I read were very interesting to me. One of these things is that hope and despair are opposite experiences. Hope is the opposite of despair, and despair is the opposite of hope. And one of the things that I was reading about this past week is that we have a choice to make whether we live lives of hope or lives of despair. In fact, it is said that humans are the only life form that can make that choice. And we can make that choice, and we do. You know, people joke about how there are people that look at life through a glass half full, and then there are people that look at a glass as half empty. And the ones that look at a glass as half full tend to be full of hope, sometimes to a fault of overlooking things that maybe they should be paying more attention to. And those who look at life as a glass half empty tend to have more despair in their lives because they're focusing on what's not there or what is wrong as opposed to what is there. So that's a decision we all make. And I've learned as a person who tends to look at a glass half full to be a little more circumspect in terms of things I should be concerned about. And my wife is one of those people who looks at a glass half empty, and she's learning that maybe you don't have to worry about everything in that empty glass. Things do take care of themselves. So hope is a decision, and that was one of the things that I read about, and I think we ought to consider that. Another thing I read is that we all deal in the daily lives that we live. We all deal with circumstances, some of which we look at through the eyes of hope, and others we see that bring despair in our lives. And maybe in a day's time there's 5 or 6 conversations, or we're reading an article, or we're watching a TV show when we have feelings of hope, and then the next 5 minutes we've got feelings of despair. So we as humans bounce back and forth between hope and despair, and that's just part of the human condition. But the other thing I read about hope that I think is very interesting and really got my attention, and that is that hope is to our spiritual and emotional well-being the same that water and food and air are to our physical well-being. Hope is absolutely essential to our emotional and spiritual well-being. And without hope, we cannot live fulfilled lives. It just can't do it. Just as though we can't live our physical lives without food, air, and water for very long. So hope is an absolute essential dimension of our lives. And so that's the reason I wanted to spend some time on hope tonight. Hope is different from hopeful wishing. And I want to talk about that for a few minutes. Hopeful wishing is what people are doing when they say this: I'm going to hope for the best, but I'm going to plan for the worst. That is hopeful wishing. That is saying, I am so certain there's a shoe to drop around the corner that I'm not going to let my guard down. I hope this happens, but I'm going to prepare for the absolute worst. That's what's called hopeful wishing. And you know, as a matter of practical advice, that may not be all bad. But I need to say to you now, that is not the definition of genuine Christian hope. Genuine Christian hope is the expectation that certain things will happen. I expect this to happen. I don't wish this will happen. I have invested my life in this happening. I am so certain of it. And so I'm mindful of the words of Jesus when he said, if you were on a game show and somebody said, quote, an exact quote from Jesus, and you can win $1 million, one of the things you might say, because we all know this verse that this statement Jesus made, come unto me, all ye who are heavy laden, and I will give you peace. He didn't say, come unto me, all you are heavy laden, and if I can get around to it, and if things work out for me, I'm going to give you peace. That's hopeful wishing. He said, I will give you peace. That is the expectation of Christian hope. God is with us, always leading us to a better place. In fact, you've heard me say this several times in my time with you, and I'm beginning to think that's the theme of my ministry in Dillon with you, and that is no matter what happens, God is with us, leading us to a better place. And for me, that's the message of Christmas. But you know, coming to that degree of certainty doesn't come easy. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to expect God to be with me and leading me to a better place, and I'm not going to worry about all this stuff that I worry about. You can't just say that. How do we come to that place? Well, I read an article recently by probably the most popular and well-known, I guess not necessarily popular, but the most well-known Protestant theologian of our time, named Paul Tillich. And Paul Tillich is no longer alive, but he has influenced all Protestant theology since he immigrated from Germany, and it was an outstanding theologian. He got to thinking about this business of certainty. And he wrote an essay called The Right to Hope. And that essay basically said there are seeds of hope all around us. And we should place our hope in those things for which we can see the seeds of hope around us. That if we open our eyes and pay attention, if we decide we're going to look not at the glass half empty, but the glass half full, we will in fact be full of hope. So we have a right to hope, but it's based on the seeds of hope that are all around us. This idea was picked up, actually, I don't think the person that I'm going to tell you about, named Zechariah, knew too much about Paul Tillich. But he was getting at the same thing when he made a graduation speech to the graduates of Harvard University some years back. You may know this name, Zechariah. He has a show on CNN, but it's during church time, so we don't often get to see that. But he's a journalist, and he's highly thought of and very thoughtful. And he's an American-born Egyptian, and is making a big imprint on our political and social thought in this country. So he made this presentation, this graduation speech to the graduate students of Harvard University. And this was his point. He knew he was talking to students who were immersed in the social problems of our world, and who, in the process of being immersed in those problems, had very little hope for the future of the world. The more you study problems, the more depressed you get, and the more despairing you get. And he knew he was talking about these students who were planning to go out with their education and try to change things, but who in the back of their mind wonders if change could come. And so he gave a talk, and he said, you know, when you leave this place and going into the world, into your career, you need to be aware of some things I'm aware of and that I'm going to share with you, that there are grounds for hope in this world. And I wanted to read to you several of the things he said, because I think they're just as true today as they were a couple of years ago. He pointed to the fact that the world we live in is profoundly in peace. The richest country of the world are not in geopolitical competition with one another, fighting wars or engaging in arms races or cold wars. Yes, we have small battles going on, but the world is not at war. We're coping with terrorism, he says, and we think we live in dangerous times. But consider the number of people who have died as the result of civil war or terrorism is down 50% from the 90s, and 75% from the 70s, and 90% since World War II, the number of people who have died in wars. We may be living in a peaceful time in human history. Since our future hope for a world at peace is sown, it is sown in our time today. And that was one of the points he wanted to make, the seeds of hope. We don't think about that too much when we read the news. Then he pointed to the political stability that allowed the emergence of a global economy. And this is very significant. He said the global economy is growing 5 times as fast as it did 30 years ago. Those were the good old days. As a result, it's estimated that poverty has been reduced in the world in the past 50 years, and more in the past 50 years than in the previous 500 years. Reduction in poverty. More in the last 50 years than in the last 500 years. Life expectancy has risen dramatically in our time. We gain 5 hours of life expectancy every day because of medical science. A third of the babies born in the developed world will live to be 100. A third of the babies born in the world will live to be 100. Living standards, hygiene, medicine are responsible. We have come a long way since the simple amputations had a 300% fertility rate. Third, we live in an age of technological progress. The cell phone in your pocket, it's in my pocket, has more computing power than the Apollo space capsule. We are advancing technology and able to do things in science and medicine that we never thought were possible. This is the third industrial revolution that we're living in. Then he said, look at the number of college graduates globally. It has risen 4-fold in the last 40 years. 7-fold for women. We're living in a world where historically repressed women are enabled by the women vote. And finally, he said, we have the largest and most dynamic economy in the world, dominant in technology, host to hundreds of the world's great companies, has the largest capital markets, has most of the world's greatest universities. There is no Harvard equivalent in China or India. So what he's doing for these students and what he does for us is realize the seeds of hope are out there if we would just look at them and just think about them. And it's the seeds of hope that we glom onto as we seek to develop a hopeful understanding of what's going on in the world. And as a pastor and a theologian, a trained theologian, what I like to think is that God is at work in the world, leading us all into a better place. And that's the certainty that we need when we decide we're going to live life hopefully. Now we're at Christmas. We're at Christmas Eve. And we are talking about the birth of a baby that grew up to change the world in just a few years. And what I think that happened at that time is God actually planted the seeds of hope on this earth. And those seeds have multiplied. During Jesus' time, they multiplied, and amazing things happened. And after his death, they multiplied more, and they multiplied throughout the world, and they multiply among us now in our towns, in our cities, in our church. Seeds of hope are growing. We see it in the acts of love and kindness. We see the acts of bravery on behalf of others. We see people living the life that Jesus lived and amazing things happening. So those are the seeds of hope, too, that we need to look at when we're talking about hope. The writer said, we cannot live without hope any more than we can live without food, water, or air. We must have hope. And we are learning from a secular social scientist and a Protestant theologian that the seeds of hope are all around us in the lives of people, growing and spreading. And you can't deny that we are not making great progress. So this Christmas, I invite you to a life of hope. I invite you to an expectation, not a hopeful wish, that God is in the world leading us to a better place. And that is the meaning of Christmas. Amen.